In a mansion of glittering wealth, a nanny's unspoken love for a child sparks a scandal at a lavish gala, unraveling secrets that threaten to shatter a carefully curated world. Welcome to Life Bond Tales. Like and share the story with those who need love. The Langley estate rose like a cathedral of wealth in the heart of an exclusive gated community, its ivory columns and sprawling lawns basking under the gentle glow of the morning sun, each hedge trimmed with surgical precision to maintain an illusion of flawless order. Inside, the air was perfumed with the faint tang of lemon polish and fresh orchids arranged in crystal vases, but the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers cast a sterile sheen, as if the house were a museum curated for admiration rather than living. Clara, a woman in her late 30s with warm brown eyes that held both kindness and a quiet sorrow, moved through the nursery with a grace that softened the room's cold edges, her soft humming of an old lullaby threading warmth into the pale mint walls adorned with hand-painted clouds. She knelt beside 5-year-old Noah, a boy with a mop of chestnut curls and a smile that flickered like a fragile flame, tying his shoelaces with hands worn from years of tending to others, her touch steady and tender as she whispered encouragement, her voice a soothing balm against the estate's relentless perfection. Noah giggled as she adjusted his tiny sweater, his small fingers clutching her sleeve, seeking the comfort only she seemed to provide in this cavernous home. Across the grand foyer, Margaret Langley descended the sweeping staircase, her heels striking the tiles with the crisp rhythm of a metronome, her tailored silk dress catching the light like a polished sapphire, every fold a testament to her meticulous control. A woman in her early 40s, Margaret's sharp blue eyes and immaculate auburn hair pinned in an elegant chignon radiated authority, her every gesture calculated to uphold her status among the elite. She was orchestrating a charity gala, an event less about compassion and more about cementing her social capital, her leather-bound planner filled with notes on imported peonies, string quartets, and a guest list curated with the precision of a high society alchemist. To Margaret, Noah was a charming accessory, a prop to be dressed in crisp linens and presented with a practiced smile, his emotional needs outsourced to the staff she acknowledged only when necessary. Clara, though, was far more than staff to Noah. She was the one who knew the exact way he liked his peanut butter sandwiches, cut into triangles, no crusts, the one who could coax laughter from him with a silly rhyme about dancing frogs, the one who sat by his bedside when nightmares crept in, her presence a lighthouse in the dark. Their bond was a quiet tapestry, woven through countless small moments, wiping jelly from his chin, teaching him to trace his name in wobbly letters, singing lullabies that carried a weight Margaret could never fathom. In a stolen moment, as Noah napped beneath a soft quilt Clara had tucked around him, she slipped a hand into her faded apron pocket, retrieving a worn silver locket, its surface etched with faint scratches from years of being held. Inside was a faded photograph of a little girl, Lily, her round cheeks dimpled with a grin, her bright eyes sparkling with uncontained joy, a snapshot of a life that once filled Clara's world with color. Clara's gaze softened, her thumb tracing the locket's edge as a shadow of grief crossed her face, her heart heavy with the loss she carried in silence, a wound that had never fully healed. She closed the locket with a gentle click, tucking it away as Noah stirred, his small hand instinctively reaching for hers, even in sleep, as if he knew she was his anchor in a house that felt more like a stage than a home. The estate buzzed, with the hum of gala preparations, delivery vans unloading crates of roses and linens, caterers arranging silver trays with military precision. But Clara's world was confined to this nursery, to Noah's sleepy smiles and the quiet promise. She made to love him as fiercely as she had loved her own daughter. Margaret paused at the nursery door, her eyes flicking over the scene with a hint of impatience, her voice cutting through the air as she reminded Clara to ensure Noah remained spotless for the gala, her tone implying that any imperfection would be a personal affront. Clara nodded, her expression a mask of calm, but her hand lingered on Noah's shoulder, a subtle act of defiance against the house's rigid hierarchy. The contrast between the two women was stark. Margaret, a conductor of appearances, and Clara, a keeper of hearts, their worlds colliding in the small boy who trusted one implicitly and saw the other as a distant figurehead. As Clara guided Noah to the playroom, her steps soft against the polished floors, she carried the weight of her unspoken past, the locket a hidden reminder of the love she had lost and the love she now gave, knowing it could never fully belong to her. Clara's days in the Langley estate revolved around Noah, her quiet devotion filling the gaps left by a house that prized image over intimacy. She taught him to count by stacking colorful blocks, her laughter mingling with his as they built wobbly towers that inevitably toppled, his squeals echoing in the nursery's soft light. When he scraped his knee chasing a butterfly in the garden, Clara was the one who knelt with a bandage, kissing the hurt away, while whispering stories of brave explorers to distract him from the sting. At night, when shadows twisted into monsters, on his bedroom walls, she sat cross-legged on the floor, inventing tales of star-chasing foxes until his eyelids grew heavy, her voice a steady current pulling him to sleep. Margaret, meanwhile, was consumed by the gala, her mornings spent on phone calls with event planners, her voice clipped as she demanded flawless table settings and a harpist who could play Vivaldi without error. She rarely entered the nursery, her interactions with Noah limited to adjusting his collar or issuing brisk instructions to smile for guests, her affection as polished and distant as the silverware she inspected daily. Clara, in her faded apron, was invisible to Margaret unless a task required her. Yet Noah's eyes lit up at her approach, his small arms wrapping around her legs, as if she were the only solid thing in his world. One afternoon, as Clara sliced apples into perfect crescents for Noah's snack, he scampered into the kitchen, a crayon drawing clutched in his fist, proudly showing her a scribbled sun with her name beneath it. Before she could respond, Margaret swept in, her heels clicking like a judge's gavel, and caught Noah's gleeful cry of, "Mama Clara!" Her face tightened, lips thinning as she corrected him sharply, insisting he call her by her proper name, her tone slicing through the warmth of the moment. Clara's heart sank, but she kept her gaze steady, nodding silently as she handed Noah his plate, her fingers brushing his in a quiet reassurance. Later, alone in the laundry room, folding Noah's tiny shirts, she overheard the housekeeper whisper to the gardener about Margaret's obsession with appearances, how the gala was less about charity and more about outshining her rivals. Clara said nothing, but the words lingered, a reminder of her place in this world of curated perfection. Margaret's instructions grew stricter as the gala neared, demanding Clara wear a shapeless grey uniform that blended into the background, her presence meant to be felt but not seen. In a rare moment of stillness, Clara retreated to the attic storage room, where she kept a small box of keepsakes hidden behind a stack of linens. Inside was a tiny pair of knitted booties, pale pink and impossibly soft, once worn by Lily during her first winter. Clara held them to her chest, her breath catching as memories flooded back, Lily's giggles as they danced in the kitchen, her tiny hand clutching Clara's finger during fevered nights. The loss was a weight she carried daily, yet caring for Noah had opened a crack in her grief, letting light seep through in his trusting smiles and eager questions. She tucked the booties away, her resolve hardening to give Noah the love he craved, even if it meant navigating Margaret's rules like a tightrope. One evening, as Clara read Noah a story about a lost duckling finding its way home, he nestled against her, whispering that he wished she could stay forever. Her throat tightened, knowing her role was temporary, her love a borrowed gift in a house that didn't value it. Margaret's voice cut through the moment, calling Noah for a fitting, her tone impatient as she reminded Clara to prepare him for the gala's spotlight. Clara complied, smoothing Noah's hair with a tenderness that belied the ache in her chest, her hands steady, despite the growing tension between her heart and the estate's expectations. The gala loomed like a storm on the horizon, its demands pulling Margaret further from Noah and pushing Clara deeper into the shadows, her love for the boy a quiet rebellion against the house's cold order. The Langley estate transformed into a vision of splendor as the charity gala unfolded, its gardens aglow with golden string lights that twinkled like captured stars, casting a soft sheen over tables draped in ivory linens and adorned with roses flown in from Provence. A string quartet filled the air with delicate melodies, their notes blending with the clink of crystal flutes, and the murmurs of guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, each smile a calculated display of wealth and grace. Clara moved silently, along the edges, her grey uniform rendering her nearly invisible, as she adjusted Noah's bow tie, her fingers gentle against his squirming protests that it scratched his neck. She whispered a playful promise of extra cookies later, coaxing a grin from him before guiding him to the lawn, where he clutched a juice glass like a treasure, his eyes scanning the crowd for her familiar presence. Margaret, radiant in a sapphire gown that caught every eye, glided among her guests, her laughter a practiced chime as she shared anecdotes about her latest philanthropy, her every word polished to perfection. The guests, a parade of doctors, investors, and socialites, nodded approvingly, their pearls and cufflinks gleaming under the soft light, unaware of the boy who fidgeted beside a hedge, longing for the comfort of the woman in the shadows. As the evening peaked, Margaret took her place at the center of the garden, a sparkling rosé in hand, her posture flawless as she raised her glass for a toast, her voice smooth and commanding, thanking her guests for supporting such a noble cause. The quartet fell silent, and all eyes turned to her, the moment choreographed to cement her status as the epitome of elegance and generosity. But then, a small voice pierced the hush, clear and unyielding, shattering the carefully crafted scene. Noah, standing near a dessert table laden with macarons, broke free from the crowd, his tiny shoes scuffing the grass as he ran toward Clara, who stood by a serving station, her tray of canapés forgotten. "Mama Clara," he shouted, his face alight with joy, holding out a crumpled daisy he'd plucked from the garden's edge. The word "mama" hung in the air like a thunderclap, heads turning, champagne flutes pausing mid-sip, a ripple of gasps spreading through the guests. Margaret's smile froze, her glass tilting slightly as color drained from her cheeks, her eyes darting to Clara, who stood rooted, her expression calm, but her heart pounding. Noah reached her, wrapping his arms around her waist, the daisy smearing pollen across her uniform as he beamed up at her, oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. "I picked this for you," he whispered, his voice proud and pure. Margaret forced a brittle laugh, stepping forward to address the crowd, her voice high and strained as she dismissed the outburst, saying Noah was just confused, that Clara was merely the nanny, nothing more. But Noah, undeterred, clung tighter, his voice rising as he declared, "She loves me best." The words landed like a spark in dry grass, igniting whispers among the guests, some amused, others uncomfortable, their eyes flicking between the boy, the nanny, and the mother whose composure was unraveling. Clara knelt to Noah's level, her tray steady despite the tremor in her hands, and brushed a curl from his forehead, her voice soft as she thanked him for the flower, her eyes warm with love but shadowed by the weight of the moment. "A guest," murmured to another, questioning who this woman was to inspire such devotion, while another stifled a chuckle, the tension palpable as Margaret's smile grew tighter, her fingers gripping her glass like a lifeline. Clara rose, guiding Noah gently back toward the crowd, her touch reassuring as she whispered to him to stay with his mother, but the damage was done. The truth of their bond had spilled into the open, a raw, unscripted truth that no amount of champagne or charm could erase. The quartet resumed, their music a feeble attempt to restore order, but the air buzzed with an undercurrent of unease, the gala's perfection cracked by a child's honest heart. Clara retreated to the shadows, her uniform blending into the dusk, but the daisy in her hand felt like a beacon, a small defiant symbol of the love she gave so freely and the world she could never fully claim. The morning after the gala, the Langley estate was cloaked in a silence heavier than its usual pristine hush, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels bruised. Clara moved through her duties with mechanical precision, wiping down the nursery's toys and folding Noah's pajamas, her hands steady but her chest tight, with the memory of his voice calling her Mama. The staff whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward her with quiet sympathy, the cook pausing to squeeze her shoulder as she passed the kitchen. Margaret, seated in the sunroom with a cup of chamomile she barely touched, stared out at the garden where her perfect evening had unraveled, her jaw set in a line of barely contained fury. By midday, she summoned Clara to the study, A room of dark oak and leather-bound books where Clara rarely set foot unless delivering linens. Edward, Margaret's husband, stood by the window, his presence as rare as it was detached, his briefcase still in hand, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret's voice was ice, her words clipped as she announced that Clara's services would end in 2 weeks, citing her inappropriate influence over Noah as a threat to their family's image. Clara stood still, her face a mask of calm, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the weight of the accusation settling like dust. Before she could respond, a high-pitched wail erupted from the hallway, and Noah burst in, his face red and streaked with tears, his small body trembling, as he flung himself at Clara's legs, begging her not to leave. His sobs were raw, unfiltered, a child's grief spilling over the room's polished restraint, and Clara knelt to hold him, her arms a fortress against his fear. Margaret's composure cracked, her voice sharp as she ordered Noah to stop, her hands pulling at him with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, but he clung tighter, his cries muffling against Clara's shoulder. Edward shifted uncomfortably, muttering about finding a replacement, his words as cold as the marble underfoot. Clara whispered to Noah, her voice soft but steady, promising he'd be okay, her eyes meeting his with a love that felt like a lifeline. As Margaret finally pried Noah away, his wails echoing down the hall, Clara rose, her dignity unshaken, and nodded her agreement to leave, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm. Alone that night in her small room, a space as spare as her place in the household, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, the silence pressing against her like a weight. She opened her keepsake box, pulling out Lily's knitted booties. Their pink threads faded from time, and held them to her cheek, her breath hitching as memories surged. Lily's fevered cries in a hospital room, the sterile beep of machines. The moment the doctor's words stole her world, the loss had carved a hollow in her, yet Noah's love had begun to fill it, his trust a fragile gift she'd cradled through every story and scraped knee. Now, facing another goodbye, the ache felt like losing Lily all over again, a wound torn open by a child's desperate plea. She traced the booty's stitches, her tears falling silently, and whispered an apology to Lily for failing to protect another heart she'd grown to love. In the kitchen the next day, the cook, wiping flour from his hands, spoke in a low voice about Margaret's obsession with control, how she'd spent the morning phoning friends to spin Noah's outburst as childish fancy, her pride stinging more than her heart. Clara listened without speaking, her hands busy slicing carrots for Noah's lunch, but the cook's words echoed her own thoughts. This house valued appearances over truth, and her love for Noah was a truth it couldn't bear. She packed his lunch with care, slipping in an extra apple slice shaped like a star, a small act of defiance against the dismissal looming over her. Noah, quieter now, clung to her side whenever Margaret wasn't near, his eyes searching hers for reassurance she could only half give. As she tucked him in that night, his small hand gripped hers, his voice trembling as he asked if she'd forget him. Clara's heart cracked, but she smiled, promising he'd always have a piece of her, her words a vow she'd carry beyond the estate's gates. The study's verdict hung over her, a countdown to an ending she couldn't fight. But in Noah's tearful gaze she saw the love she'd given, a love that no dismissal could erase. A week after the gala, the Langley estate buzzed with preparations for another fundraiser, this time for a children's hospital, a spectacle Margaret orchestrated to reclaim her social standing, her blush-pink dress chosen for its photogenic glow under the afternoon sun. Clara, still bound by her final days of employment, moved through the event's edges, her grey uniform a shadow as she carried trays of sparkling water, her presence unnoticed by the chattering guests in their tailored elegance. The garden shimmered, with crystal decanters and laughter that rang hollow, but Clara's focus was on Noah, who lingered near the dessert table, his eyes searching for her in the crowd, a quiet sadness in his gaze since the study's verdict. The event's centerpiece was Dr. Amara Patel, a pediatric surgeon whose recent TED Talk had made her a rising star, her deep brown skin radiant against her emerald suit as she mingled with donors, her smile warm yet commanding. As Clara sat down a tray near the rose trellis, Amara's eyes caught hers, and time seemed to pause, her confident stride faltering as recognition sparked. She crossed the lawn, ignoring curious glances, and called Clara's name, her voice trembling with disbelief. Clara turned, her breath catching as Amara enveloped her in an embrace, tears brimming as she whispered that she'd never expected to find her here, the woman who'd changed her life. Years ago, in a crowded foster home, Clara had been Amara's caregiver, sneaking her library books, sitting with her through math homework, telling her she could be anything when the world saw nothing. Amara, now holding Clara's hands, her tailored cuffs contrasting with Clara's worn sleeves, turned to the stunned guests and declared that this woman, dismissed as mere help, was the reason she stood before them as a doctor. Her voice rose, steady but fierce, recounting how Clara's patience had taught her to read, how her belief had fueled her dreams, how her love had been a lifeline when no one else cared. The crowd fell silent, phones lowering as guests absorbed the weight of her words, their curated smiles fading. Margaret, standing by a floral arch, gripped her clutch, her face paling as Amara's speech shifted the spotlight, exposing the truth of Clara's impact. Our guest, moved by the moment, recorded it, the video spreading online within minutes, comments flooding in from strangers who saw their own caregivers in Clara, nannies, teachers, neighbors who'd given love without fanfare. Hashtags like Dice Unsung Heroes trended, stories pouring in, a man crediting his nanny for teaching him courage, a woman sharing a photo of her childhood caregiver who'd bandaged her heart as much as her knees. Clara stood still, Amara's hand on her shoulder, her eyes brimming, but her posture unbroken, the daisy from Noah tucked in her pocket like a talisman. Margaret, cornered by the narrative she couldn't control, approached Clara later, her voice tight as she suggested reconsidering her dismissal, framing it as concern for Noah but betraying a need to salvage her image. Clara met her gaze, her voice quiet but resolute, refusing to stay where her worth was only valued for optics, her words carrying the weight of years spent in silence. Edward, lingering nearby, muttered about the publicity, his discomfort clear as socialites now whispered about Clara's grace, not Margaret's gala. Amara, overhearing, pulled Clara aside, promising to support her next steps, her eyes fierce, with gratitude and determination. As the event wound down, guests approached Clara, some offering awkward thanks, others sharing stories of their own unsung heroes, their voices soft with newfound respect. Clara nodded, her responses gentle but guarded, her heart still heavy with the goodbye looming over her and Noah. The viral video reached beyond the estate, sparking calls from local reporters and non-profits, but Clara's focus remained on the boy who'd called her Mama, his trust a light she couldn't bear to dim. In her room that night she traced the edges of Lily's booties, her tears falling not for the recognition but for the children she'd loved and lost, and the one she'd soon leave behind. Amara's words had shifted something, not just in the guests but in Clara herself, a spark of possibility that her love could find a new home, one where it wouldn't be confined to the shadows. The estate's grandeur felt smaller now, its walls unable to contain the truth of what she'd given, and for the first time, Clara felt the stirrings of a future where her heart could lead. Clara's final day at the Langley estate dawned with a quiet clarity, the morning sun casting long shadows across the polished floors as she packed her suitcase, her movements deliberate, each item a piece of a life she'd lived in the margins. The house hummed with its usual order, fresh lilies in the foyer, the faint scent of wax on the banisters, but the air felt different, charged with the weight of her departure. Noah, sensing the shift, trailed her like a shadow, his small hands tugging at her sleeve, his eyes wide with a fear he couldn't name. Clara knelt to tie his shoes one last time, her smile soft but strained, promising him a story later as she handed him a small book of tales they'd read together, its pages worn from countless nights under the nursery's glow. Outside, the estate's gates loomed, a threshold between the world she'd known and the one waiting beyond. As she carried her suitcase down the back staircase, Noah's footsteps pounded behind her, his voice breaking as he called her name, his small body crashing into her, with a desperate hug that nearly toppled them both. She knelt again, cupping his tear-streaked face, her voice steady as she told him he'd always carry her love, urging him to be brave and kind, especially when no one watched. Her kiss on his forehead lingered, a silent vow, before she gently pried his fingers from her coat and turned away, her steps firm despite the ache in her chest. The gates closed behind her with a soft clang, not of finality but of freedom, the world opening wide as she walked into it. Weeks later, in a quiet neighborhood far from the estate's gilded sprawl, a small building bloomed with life, its windows painted with colorful handprints and its sign reading Lily's Haven in bold blue letters. Funded by Amara's donations and contributions from those touched by Clara's story online, the center was a sanctuary for children who needed more than a roof, a place for those in foster care, those with working parents, those craving a safe hand to hold. Inside, laughter spilled from crayon-streaked walls, where reading nooks shaped like treehouses cradled children with books, and a corner of beanbags invited shy newcomers to feel at home. Clara, free from the grey uniform, wore a soft sweater, dusted with glitter from a morning art project. Her presence a steady heartbeat in the chaos of giggles and spilled juice. She moved through the rooms with purpose, crouching to listen as a girl shared a whispered fear, helping a boy glue a paper star to his drawing, her hands as gentle as they'd been with Noah, but now unburdened by rules. On the wall above her desk hung the book she'd given Noah, mailed back to her by the cook with a note saying he'd wanted her to keep it, its cover adorned with a new drawing of two stick figures under a sun, labeled Noah and Mama Clara. Beside it, Lily's locket rested in an open box, its presence a quiet reminder of the love that had shaped this place. Offers poured in, publishers wanting her memoir, non-profits seeking her leadership, but Clara chose to stay small, knowing children needed her presence more than her fame. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the haven's windows, a shy boy tugged at her sleeve, showing her a picture of a house with a heart-shaped roof, his voice soft as he called her Miss Clara, the title carrying the same trust Noah once gave. She smiled, her eyes bright with tears she didn't hide, and read to a circle of children, one nestled against her, another clutching her hand, their warmth filling the hollows left by loss. Outside, the world buzzed with stories of her. Posts, still circulating, strangers sharing how caregivers like Clara had shaped their lives. But here, in this small haven, she was simply herself, a woman who loved without limit. As the day ended, Clara stood at the door waving to children running to their guardians, her heart full yet aching for the boy she'd left behind. She touched the book on her wall, whispering a promise to Noah that she'd carry him always, just as she carried Lily. Lily's Haven wasn't just a place, it was a testament to her heart, a home built from pain and transformed into purpose, where every child who crossed its threshold found not just care, but a love that saw them whole.